Ta-da. So, good morning. I'm going to go and grab a piece of paper so that I can draw on it if I need it. I'll be right back. Alrighty. Hi there. I made it back. This is me back from my resting up and stuff and doing another live stream, and we're going to see what we can get out of this. I'm going to take a minute and load up GitHub in case I need to look up any source code for anybody. And then at that point, I think probably I'll just be hanging out, chilling. I can tell you how my week went, or the last couple of weeks went, and regale you with more tales of birds and things like that. And I also brought a little show and tell of something that I'm going to be doing later on this afternoon. Hey, Patrick. Hey, Gemma. And my coffee is really hot, but I have a particularly mellow sort of coffee today. It's Brattleboro Co-op's Breakfast Blend Dark, and I thought it was sort of really kind of fruity and unctuous and mellow and stuff, because usually I tend to go for this kind that's Pierce Brothers Frogbuster. Not Frogbuster, Fogbuster. And that's almost like that sort of high-test Death Wish coffee that's all, I'm trying to think, it's not Colombian. There's some kind of, Robusta. A fair amount of time I just go for this Fogbuster blend, which I think has a bunch of Robusta thrown into it. In fact, I did not solve the bird issue, but I have a workaround, and I'm also exploring the idea that maybe it's just a condition where if flocks of this particular little bird are in nearby areas and their population pressure gets too much, they start freaking out and trying to find any possible place to make nests or whatever, and that's what causes it. Because some years I don't have this at all, and then other years it's an enormous pain in the butt. So as I came down to make coffee this morning, I noticed there was another bird in the wood stove. So if that happens during the stream, I will show you what I did. Because this time around, I was not using the thing. Yeah, it was well enough. I was not using the thing that tried to confine it in a space where I could remove it, which backfired and wound up with just a live bird trapped in there somewhere. Instead, it was kind of all open. So what I had was a live bird just in the main area of the wood stove, which is, pretty much worst if you're going to try to capture it in some way, but the easiest as far as if you believe they can get out themselves. So I did the whole thing that I've learned to do, and this time it worked even better than the previous time I tried it. As the sequence of it was, first time I had one loosen the whole wood stove, and there was nothing to do about it but open the door. And so I opened my front door and made everything else super dark. And it tried to go out the front door and failed. And then got trapped in my corridor, but in a place where it was kind of like it still had a clear shot at the door. Because what I need to do is avoid jump scares. I need to not have wild animals lurking in my house ready to do jump scares at me. That is, jump scares and me do not work. I am too old. I am too highly strung. It'll probably kill me. I don't want that. and it's just unpleasant. So we're trying to avoid that. So first time, I had a path to a completely open and blindingly bright doorway for the bird, because that's what you got to do, is you make it so that there's a super bright area and that is open to the outside. I can't do that with the windows because I have my windows sort of sealed off for thermal purposes to stay warm in winter, and it also stays cool in summer, so I can't do that. But I do have an available door. So first time, it went for the door, bonked off of the wall and top above the door, went to a different place, and from that different place, it still had a clear shot at the door. So as soon as I approached it, it went whoosh past my head, bulleted out the door, and was fine. So that was more dramatic than I like, but it wasn't all that bad, and it was a happy ending. Second time, thing got trapped and hurt in the stove, and it didn't work out very well. And that was the live one, and then I went to BronyCon, so I was away for a little while, and I don't advertise that because that's just general good practice for a YouTube person or somebody who, streams from their house or whatever. But upon getting back this afternoon, it's still morning. It is just barely past 11 where I am. I came down to make my coffee and found another bird, and I had removed the thing that hurt the other bird and made it so that this time it was possible for a bird to get into the main wood stove area. And the thing about that is, if you trust the bird to be able to make it outside when you open all the doors up, and this works better in the summer because it would really suck in the winter, and it would really suck if the stove was in use. But and that would suck ungodly bad if the stove was in use. There's nothing you can do about that. That happened to me once. It was very tragic. If you have this, and also I tried to do something clever which did not work. I took a giant bottle of ammonia, which I don't even really use for cleaning, so I have had that for I don't know how many years, just tucked away in the back of a cabinet. I took this giant bottle of ammonia, put it inside the wood stove, took the cap off, and left it there. Because air kind of flows up through, hot air rises and stuff, and so air kind of flows up through the wood stove thing. And the idea was that if there are birds checking this area out and going should I do this? They should smell the ammonia and go, oh, there's a cat here. I don't like this. I'm gone. And I did that over the last couple of weeks and thought that it was working pretty good. And then this morning, there's this hapless bird. It's sitting in there by this 2-gallon jug of ammonia. It's not big enough to knock the jug over or anything like that, but it's got to be oh, I smell so much cat around. And there it was. So this morning, before I even made coffee, because I don't need to get more jacked up and tense for that, I went and darkened everything like mad, like it was for one of my Tuesday live streams on the, dark light show kind of things. I just had to make everything dark. I had worked on some doors upstairs because I have this little 2-story house. And previously I'd had them so that they didn't really close very well. This morning's Tweety got away. So I had to work on the doors as well so that they would close, because otherwise I would have a Tweety getting into my closets or something, and it would be all the jump scare forever. And successfully did that. So the upstairs was closed. That also made it kind of more dark. And I have my drapes that I hang over the shade, the windows, and the shades to pull down. So I did that. And I hung a drape over the entry into the kitchen because they don't have a door there at the moment. And then I opened the front door. I cowered behind the door of the wood stove like some cowering small kitten being threatened by a big, mean, scary monster, and opened the door, and with a big fluttering, Tweety of August 12 bulleted out of the wood stove in great enthusiasm and went straight through the door and outside. Yep. This Tweety got out alive. I took the jug of ammonia and put the cap back on it and put it back under my sink because it did not help. I don't know what the deal is. I clearly am simply going to have to get the different kind of chimney cap that, as my chimney sweep says, is not attractive to birds. Because this is not, But I feel like I have a kind of workaround by just not trying to force outcomes too much in a way. And there's still a chance that it's like, okay, I tried doing this thing. The bird is a complete idiot because, of course, it's a complete idiot. I've been learning that. It's probably a different one every time. And I give it the door to go through, and instead it, I don't know, goes into the kitchen where there's also light, although I'm doing my best to block it off, or goes through my curtains somehow, even though they're black in color and solid, or it just randomly gets somewhere in my house where it's going to be bursting up in a hysterical flutter, like every 6 hours, and then I can't sleep, and I have a coronary, and I fall over dead, and the bird is screwed because then I can't let it out. So that would be bad. We don't want that. But the end game is not only to perfect the extraction routine, but also to replace this dumb chimney top thing up there. And I know somebody who's actually retiring from chimney sweeping, but I don't know if he's retired yet. And he told me he could do it, and it's going to cost me a little bit. But, Define fuel Rex. I've never seen that word before. What comes to mind immediately is like, oh, apparently I should put out birdhouses so that they don't try to go up there because they have better places to be. I could live with that. That would work. I have no objection to them unless they are doing jump scares at me, and I don't like the jump scare part at all. But, yeah. And so, yeah, I have survived this morning's Tweety visitation. It does honestly look very much like the bird that sat checking out Bernie Sanders famously. In that famous moment that people were like, oh, praise Bernie, praise Bernie. I supported him last time around. I feel that he's not the only possibility this time around. At any rate, I don't want to do field recordings inside my wood stove. That seems like it would only lead to bad. Let's not go there. And honestly, my experience with this set of birds, it's always the same kind of bird because I believe that larger birds can't possibly get in there. Only a very limited class of bird can even get into what's up there now. It's just that there's no mesh or anything up there. There's nothing to do about it. And if I'm not mistaken, let me make sure that everything is all copacetic. I'm not necessarily being too loud in the recording, although I can still clip it if necessary. And I have my chat visible, so it always makes me anxious because here's an important thing about just kind of reality and being an intelligent being. None of these birds are attacking me. They were stupid and fell down a hole. They're innocent creatures, and they don't mean me any harm, and all they want to do is get back outside again. They're not smart enough to do that very well, although if I really help them a lot, sometimes they have a fair chance at it. At the same time, I am a hopefully intelligent, hairless ape-like creature coming from a long legacy of other creatures. I have canine teeth and am a combination sort of herbivore predator kind of thing. Technically, we're an apex predator. And still have the same animalistic emotions of any other critter, including the birds themselves. And if I am frightened badly enough, I will begin to get angry at the thing that is frightening me. So that can lead to sad places. One of my goals here is to set things up so that I don't wind up doing an all-out war against hapless wildlife that's done stupid things. But I did survive, and yeah, I mean, I'm over 51 years old and way too high-strung. And I do have to respect that. Also, I try to, over the last couple of weeks, I've actually been not guzzling as much coffee as I might normally do. I've been taking it as a kind of recalibration, because the only way to sort of stay on target on a task like making plugins on a weekly basis for half a year on end is to push way too hard. And you find yourself doing things like drinking too much coffee. If it wasn't for the fact that I got clean and sober a bunch of years ago, I would definitely be all like meth mouth guy. And I'd be talking really incredibly fast in the videos, but they might not make a lot of sense. And that is what would happen if I was trying to keep up with what seems necessary for being Airwindows and running that kind of stuff. So these are things to be taken seriously and to be learned from. Because, I mean, it's not just me. I'm helping out people who could use help in having plugin support and the ability to have tools for the stuff that they do. And if I'm in the position of doing that, and I'm successfully doing it, it means there are people who need me to not be wrecking myself trying to keep up with some self-imposed deadline or purpose. I am also a tea fancier. Actually, this morning, getting up in the morning, I got a cup of chai tea instead of coffee, and it seemed to work out pretty good. There are times when I get really into drinking coffee, and then there are times when I pull back on it. Really early on, when I was doing my no drugs and alcohol thing, which is still my thing, I did actually quit drinking coffee entirely, and I was just drinking like chai tea and stuff. And I've never actually gone full on to like no caffeine, no anything. I eat nothing but rice and water. I've never gone quite as far as all that. But I try to be open to things. Like, I know one of the things that lots of my live chat followers, a lot of you guys are vegetarians. It's interesting, and it makes me think. I don't think I'm likely to ever go full-on hardcore vegetarian, but I'm rethinking some of the things that I do. For instance, I have a fairly hearty breakfast. I have one egg omelet, and that is made with butter. And also I've been putting pesto in it, and I might try putting miso in it, because I experimented with that, and that was quite interesting. But I also cooked this a breakfast sausage, just a breakfast length sausage, and a half or third of a piece of bacon as part of the preparation for being ready to make the omelet. And I like that. I've always liked that sort of thing, but the sausage annoys me some of the time. It's like, fry, sizzle, and it spatters oil all over the place, or butter, or whatever it is that you're using for it. And, it's protein, it's food. There's other ways to get protein. For instance, I could be supplementing the tacos that I make a couple of times a week with texturized soy protein. And that would make the filling, which I already supplement with a bunch of refried beans. And I could be supplementing that with texturized soy protein and sort of leaning further in the direction of less and less and less meat products in a natural sort of way that doesn't just throw me for a loop, while that's available to me. Which might be a good idea. I think I'm warming to the idea of doing that. Because, again, like I said, cooking sausages and bacon is, it's very breakfasty for those who do that. Yeah, it's something like that. It's some kind of piggy loin. It has a lot of fat in it. That's mostly what bacon is about. I do cook in coconut oil, in fact. This is becoming the diet, chap, but that's fine. If people have plugin questions, you will ask them, and I'll try to cover them. So the thing about that, even beyond like animal cruelty concerns and stuff, because I'm like old and I'm about as mean as I am nice, and it doesn't automatically throw me the cruelty concerns, but there are higher issues or lower issues depending upon your values in there that are significant. I can't get away from, like, I could be all of the, like, I will eat all the birds, I will eat all the animals, rawr, and still wouldn't be able to get away from the fact that it takes loads of vegetables and grains to feed one of those things. And vegetables and grains are things that humans can also eat. And all of the producing of those things has an enormous carbon cost. And, these things matter. I can't always do anything directly about it, and to try to lay everything down on individual consumer choice is a horrible, horrible mistake. A lot of this is about being able to force large corporations and wealthy people to do correct things. No news in the sorting algorithm plug, Bo, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to look into that with my brother because he is going to be better at being able to cope with that, and there are some tricky things about it that I haven't solved yet. So the thing about evolving the pretty much same stuff that I eat all the time and just learning to do it a little bit differently, bit by bit, and going in a direction that I think is good is also about evolving things in a way where I feel like I am knowingly leaning in the direction of moving away from like planetary catastrophe. So let me read some of the stuff in the chat, because talking about apocalypse and tormented animals being used for food is a big freaking downer. That's why people talk about it. But Bo has raised the sorting plugin idea. For people who aren't familiar with that, the idea with that was you keep track of zero crossings, and then for all of the zero crossings that you have, you either draw a sine wave across it at whatever that is, or you literally sort all of the things and then make them symmetrical, which would mean that if you put a sine wave in, you got a sine wave out. And if you put a sine wave with noise in, you get a sine wave out without noise. And if you put a weird kind of other wave, or just whatever you have, however weird and asymmetrical it might be, you would wind up getting something that behaved a lot more like a sine wave or a synthesizer wave than you'd otherwise have, which is neat. So, yeah. And yes, I do like cooking quite a bit. Vibrato is not so much having small steps into tape degrader, although you could use it as that right out of the box. There's no reason you can't. But the thing about the tape degrader is I've been tackling a bunch of other stuff. Notably, I haven't done anything useful with the biquad filter stuff I worked out. And since I haven't done anything with that, I feel as if it might be a good idea to throw some of my ideas in that way. I do have an idea which I'm exploring, and that's kind of next up, although I could force other things to happen first. So frequency response. Suppose you did something that acted kind of like a compressor or average or something like that, any way that would track a signal. And you'd hold the signal. Here's your sense. You're sensing a notch, or it's the opposite of a notch. A notch would be this. You are sensing a bandpass of very high Q. And you have your main audio, and then you have this bandpass. There is your sense. If you apply the bandpass to the audio and maybe like notch it out and then come up with what you would need to replace it and then multiply that or something like that. You could do a 0 to however much thing where the dynamics of this would control the behavior of the band that you selected. And then you'd be able to do a dynamic, not spectrum, but a frequency mapping. Paul Frindle, who I still have lots of respect for, even though we don't always get along about everything, has famously done the dynamic spectrum mapper. And that lets you do this in many different ways and is using FFT calculations to do it. And the thing is, I don't really like FFT calculations. I don't like the sound of that processing. It always feels to me as if too much is going on and something in the texture of things are being lost. Although you can, of course, just throw more samples at it. You can throw more information at it and, crunch more CPU on it. And with the pulse thing, you probably can do this. What if you sense here and adjust here? So what that would mean is like this. Supposing you're doing some kind of bass boost, and you're going, let's add thump here. Let's add some thump at like 200 hertz because this is my kick drum, and I want the kick drum to have additional punch. If you're doing it with I'm going to come up with a clever name for it. If you have a different sense, much like a de-esser, this will act kind of a lot like a de-esser. And, interesting. I can do all pass filters. And then you set it so that your sense is affecting the dynamics of another bandpass, but it's elsewhere. And again, you can set it up so that like you're defining it as a notch. And you do that, and then the frequencies that you've got are notch, original track with the notch output subtracted, meaning that you've got this. And then if you fill this in at 1.0, it adds it back together again because it's simple Boolean operations. It's this minus this plus this equals exactly the same, so you can have very high resolution that way. But then you add more than one, and you can have it become a boost. And it would probably get louder kind of like this, that it would start becoming a bigger, wider notch rather than a bigger, wider bandpass boost, rather than simply a tighter cue. But point being, if you're triggering something like this using a compressor style or average style tracking of the contents of a different bandpass, which could be arbitrarily thin, like with one of the things that's neat about the current way of doing the biquad filters is that with the biquad filters, I can dial in insanely tight little notches, and so that becomes very possible. You could do it so that you'd have one frequency knob for the sense, one frequency knob for the result, possibly a shared cue for both of them that could go really narrow if you wanted. And then you start moving it around and doing other things. For instance, you could have a vocal brightener that was a high frequency thing, but it only started boosting to the extent that the loudness of like mid-range or 1K was there. So it would get brighter and more aggressive to the extent that the regular voice sound was there. Or you could take a kick drum and go, I want to boost the lows. Let's boost the lows like mad, but let's not have it be all sustainy and stuff. So what do? Could you put a gate on it? You could. Or you could find the area, and it would have to have some kind of switching thing, like 80 clip 7, where you could solo the notch, and you could solo the output, and you could solo all these various things so you could hear what you were doing. Because it won't have like graphics for stuff, so you'd have to be able to solo the bits that showed you what it did. You would take the kick drum, dial in the sense so that it was hearing the click on the beater. And the click on the beater would show you where, like, at the point that the click was loud, you would be doing the bass boost. And so as the click hit, suddenly bass boost, enormous thump, and then the click dies away almost immediately, even if the resonation of the drum does not. It doesn't die away completely because it's still working on just bandpasses and things. But it would be possible to do a very tight, low-frequency kick boost that acted kind of like Gatalope or something, because it would be tracking the highs rather than the lows. It'd be boosting the lows, but it'd be tracking the highs. And I feel like there's lots of stuff that could be done that way. I don't know all the possibilities, but that's because it's a very wide-ranging thing that one could do. Coffee makes my glasses fog up. So that's something that it has my attention as far as something that I'd like to try. And I'm going to see whether I can make that be a thing. It feels like it should be pretty direct. There's also something that I need to do for somebody who's not watching this, because he's a little bit too awesome to be hanging around in my streams or anything like that. But he's a friend of mine, happens to be the guy that runs the band Beauty Pill. And I'm an enormous fan of Chad Clark. And am always delighted that anytime he does anything or is anywhere. And he was asking for the equivalent of the Hughes stereo widener. That Hughes, Howard Hughes. Because Hughes did some kind of audio company at some point where he released hardware. You're awesome too, I know. You notice I was lampshading that. I was being kind of silly about it and stuff. And I would be delighted if any of these, like, if Chad showed up. I'm not sure what I would do other than promise to make this plugin for him. But I've known that Chad wanted this plugin for some time, but I didn't really have the facility to do it, because in order to do this Hughes stereo widener, you have to be able to take a stereo signal in, make it be mid-side as well as regular stereo. I can do that. And then break it down into a bunch of calibrated, tight bandpass frequencies that sound good. You need to be able to do very high Q bandpasses, these narrow little laser-like resonations, and they're at very specific frequencies. And the Hughes thing operates on the basis of various different little boosts and cuts, like stuff that is supposed to be side on to your ears is a little brighter, and I think it is 7K or something like that. Stuff that's literally straight front and forwards, you wind up having a little bit of a cut because sound bounces off your ears in a particular way. And stuff that is behind your head has a particular kind of cancellation. So there's a little funny, like, they resemble the kinds of boosts and cuts that the human ear produces to the sound. And Hughes made hardware for doing this, which is never very popular. It's the Hughes stereo widener. And Chad just swears by this thing, thinks it's the most wonderful thing ever, but would like to see it in a plugin form, and nobody is saw fit to do it. But I have the frequencies that you use, and I know basically how to do it. And now, with the biquad filter stuff, I have the correct building blocks for being able to actually put that together. So naturally, that's kind of on my mind as well. That's more work than this peak removing kind of thing that I have in mind. And that also is something for me to pay attention to. And I've also got a final, I shouldn't say final because I'm sure I'll do stuff like that in future. I set up a test because I wanted to combine or compare the way that the all-pass filter thing can do a super full range thing that'll block DC and supersonic stuff. Because I can design it in such a way that I can have a biquad-based thing that will do that. It will block the super lows. It will block Nyquist frequency. And I can put that pretty much anywhere I want if I'm satisfied with how good it sounds. But I also have my old technologies, so it becomes a thing of like, what if I do an evolution of what I was doing with, say, channel, and design a new way of doing that, and then I can call them both interstage, and see which one sounds better to me, see which one works out. And I can do things like the slew limiting or the slew clipping to the extent that I can put things like full-scale white noise through this stuff and hear how it sounds when it gets really loud, whether it'll sort of pack up in the kind of way that you'd have if you're driving a analog source too much. And well, long story short, I've got a couple of plugins still in the queue. And I'm thinking that probably next week I will bring out one of the results of this experimentation. Because here's what happened. I did this experimentation to see whether my original techniques held up to what I was able to do using the new biquad thing. And the awkward thing about it is that the techniques that I devised for this kind of stuff in a plugin called Interstage kind of kicked the butt of the biquad implementation, which was just too vanilla, too plain. So that's what's coming out. And the downside of the one coming out is that it is not going to be able to block literal DC offset nearly as well as the biquad version does. Because you can do that with the biquad. You can make it be a bandpass, and it just happens to equate to a complete and utter cancellation of super DC or whatever. And the ones that I do with my techniques from before, I got it sounding better, but at the same time, it doesn't block the DC as well. So there's that. These are reasons why I can't necessarily deliver just any given thing on any given week, is because stuff unfolds the way that it unfolds. I can't always control the way that it'll go. Any more than I can control birds getting into my stove. Although I think we'll all hope that when they do get in there, they will get in there in a way that they can safely get out, and eventually the whole situation will stop. With people talking about DAWs and things like that, there will come a time. Oh, I should check on something. I asked a question on actually Gearsluts. A fellow was asking me like, so did you try to punish Gearsluts by not posting to it this time? Because he apparently didn't notice that I did, in fact, post to it. And when I did post to Gearsluts, a couple of guys jumped on the vibrato post and were like, we're super disappointed. When are you going to do something really competitive? And a bunch of like Airwindows loyalists and fans of mine jumped down their throat on that. But I followed up by asking, like, no, hang on. Define what you want. Maybe it's something that can happen, and maybe it's just nothing that I'm going to deal with. Like, there's certain things I simply won't do. I'm just not going to deal with it. If it makes it, be competitive in the market of the plugins and things like that, I won't necessarily go, in that direction. Also, people talking about the DAWs. There will be a time that I move to Reaper. And that time is going to be when I start putting together VST plugins with GUIs and supporting only those. Now, that may or may not also mean ditching the audio units. And it probably won't mean refusing to have the plugins available at all. But the way things are looking, I think it's fairly likely that I'll eventually end up being able to add a certain amount of GUI stuff. And when I do, it'll be very interesting. But I'm betting that when I do that, it's going to be VST only. And I'm going to keep it simple in that way. Because the number of things that I have is just too huge. And I kind of got to keep things moving. So that will slow stuff down, and I'm a little bit worried about that. But if I keep it to VST 2.4, which I am legally allowed to do, then it ought to, put it this way, we'll see how that unfolds. You're not going to see it until it's ready to happen, and then I'll put something out, and then people will probably flip out and be like, oh my god, everything has to be like this. And I might wind up like re-releasing a bunch of things redesigned to have more sophisticated interface, and hopefully thinking of equally creative stuff about the interface. And the stuff that I draw on here could just as easily wind up being like sketching out interface designs on Mondays, and we'll work out what you guys need for the interfaces together. There are certain things like a channel strip that'd be much, much cooler. I will actually end up quitting Logic at some point. Logic just annoys me. Logic insists upon installing bucket loads and bucket loads of like loops and things, and they won't let you do anything else. And although I've been using it all this time, I'm not that thrilled with it compared to something like Reaper. I mean, there's open source DAWs out there. Logic is not an open source DAW. Logic has many strong points. It's very cool. There's other Apple software that I like using. I don't want to deal with Juice. Juice is very complicated. It loses me completely. I want to be dealing with just basic VST stuff, because I also want to deal with stuff that, although there's a downside there, I want to deal with stuff that people can learn themselves and it isn't too overwhelming. But also, if I'm not mistaken, Juice doesn't support back as far as I do. I'm not willing to throw some of the legacy support under the bus. I don't know how long it is before I move to Reaper. It will eventually happen. I have a full license and I have it installed, and I haven't really been using it. But I feel like Reaper is more likely to be the kind of, also somebody that I quite like. This guy that I actually was in some online music sort of collaboration things alongside. There's a guy named Kenny Joya. And back in the day, there was a website called the Mixerman.net, Mixerman website. And there were these competitions, and people would get involved in these things and collaborate over the internet. And this is a long time ago. One of the first things I did in the eye of music business in general was try to do mastering for a couple of these competitions very, very early on. And I did such a bad job that they had to run to somebody else to rescue them and do it over, which they did. And that was all cool and stuff. That was before I even had plugins. That was using technology I was calling mastering tools. It's many of the same things, but I really was like, if I tease David the Muzzle Pixley, it is affectionately because I have been that guy. And I was working with people who had many music business credits, and they had done this online collaboration for fun. And then they had trusted me with mastering it, and I did really strange things to their mastering. And that early on, people panicked and ran to a real mastering engineer to fix everything. So that was interesting. And then I didn't run away, but I still remained in the context of that and played guitar and bass once, and Nord lead synthesizer solo once on some of the other collaborations for this thing. It was called Cape, C-A-P-E. And I played on a number of those things and did quite well. There were ones that I played on that were kind of a little more amateur-y. They weren't really big names or anything like that. And I laid down some guitar that people found memorable, that they really liked the riffs that I came up in. They thought it was odd riffs, but they were memorable. They stuck. And then in the very last experience that I had before that whole thing kind of stopped, there was a track that Mixerman himself and some of his hand-picked cronies were putting together as part of this Cape. It was a sort of randomly assigned to teams type of thing. And I think some years it was randomly assigned and some years it was not. Mixerman had his dream team put together, and they were doing this thing. And I think I had some kind of guitar part, and I was asked to put rhythm parts, and I put a very unusual rhythm part that managed to make it into the final cut for like 3 seconds or whatever. There was a little burst where it's like, oh, and that part came in and it's gone. But they had this situation where they're like, oh my God, we need some kind of solo. There's a bridge here, and we need something to go in there. And they turned to me and said, can you play some kind of synthesizer thing? We saw that you got that Nord lead there. That would be probably pretty good. What can you do? Can you bring something? And in that afternoon, like within 2 hours, because that's sometimes what the music business is like. That's what some of these creative things are like, is you get a call and you're like, okay, what can you do in the next 30 minutes? And I grabbed the Nord and the little pitch stick, which is wonderful. And it'll like, wow, diddly-doo, wow, diddly-doo-wee-dee-dee. And just sent them that. And they were like, we needed 45 seconds of it. So another guy was quickly grabbed an electric sitar and was like, wheedle, 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 for the beginning of it. But it ended up with this little bridge that starts off with and you can still hear it if you find that track somewhere. You'll recognize it if you hear it. You have this bridge where it goes into the bridge part, and you got this electric sitar thing doing a sort of Steely Dan-esque, like, and then this singing synthesizer comes in and does this lovely little melodic statement and whoosh into the next bit. And that was me. I played on one of those in a very spotlit kind of way. I was the lead synthesizer solo for that little moment. So, I'm not teasing you that hard, David. I'm just saying that, we all come from somewhere. And honestly, you're walking right into it because you keep joking about using ULaw for everything, and that's a good way of making a big mess. I know you're joking, but if you joke that way, then you got to joke back. So, yeah, good times. Now, I do think I've got some questions floating around. And Chaim is repeatedly talking about, I think you're talking about crosstalk. You got to understand, I don't believe in crosstalk. I don't think it helps. That is not where analog magic comes from. That said, I can try to answer some of the questions around there. I don't think Logic has dongles. So you'll see me move to Reaper when I have stuff to use that specifically requires me to be in it. And I think it would be right up my alley. Yes, I like Kenny G. Joya. Kenny G is another guy. That's not necessarily the same one. And the reason I was talking about all of that is that I got to know Kenny there. And in fact, I mastered an album for Kenny once, a long time ago. And it came out reasonably good. But, so, how is the channel bleeding talkover thing called for a mixdown in Studio One channels? There are several things you might be asking about there, and I don't know what any of them are. Channel bleeding is called crosstalk. DAWs don't automatically have that. If they did, it wouldn't be useful. If you want to narrow a stereo field, I've got wider. That'll do that for you really well. If you want to narrow a stereo field with like bleed that's band limited in some kind of way, I suppose it's possible that at some point I'll simply have to make a stereo plugin that'll do that in a stereo thing and do my best guess at trying to emulate that behavior simply because people are so into it. But I don't buy it. I don't think that is a useful thing. Certainly not in large multi-channel things. Now, what would maybe be relevant is not that as much as, you know how I have power sag? We've had power sag for some time. And power sag is using an averaging technique. Talkover is different. Talkover is a thing called talkback. And that's what you do when you have this microphone for talkback, and it's got lots of compression, and it's in the drum room. And then if you record the talkback microphone, you get this incredibly dense, smashed thing. And generally, if you're talking about talkback, it's a special effect purpose for using a particular kind of microphone. So talkover is not a thing. Crossover and crossover bleed. A crossover is also not the thing. It's a different thing. Crosstalk, not talkover or crossover, but crosstalk is the way that coils in a transformer that's part of a tape head next to each other will bleed into each other, stuff like that. And okay, so I'm digging into this good and hard for you today because here's the thing. The putting audio into adjacent channels part itself is not the thing. You know, crosstalk. The parts of that could be relevant in any way are like this. One, if you have lots of channels cross-talking into each other, if you have a big old recording console and you go, this sounds more glued because there are many channels and they leak. It's not about whether they're leaking. It's about whether stuff happening on one channel is affecting the power supply for the whole thing. And that's different from just putting the audio in. And I've already got power sag. And power sag will do that on an individual channel basis, but what power sag will not do is take an individual track and when that goes super loud, suck energy out of the power supplies of all the other tracks. But that's what would be happening in a sufficiently large recording desk that, I mean, these things do pull a lot of energy. When they have analog weaknesses, it is because of, you know, you could be pulling 30 amps for a sufficiently large recording console with enough, you know, lots of Class A parts and things like that. And the other thing is that if you have two coils in something like a tape head, which is another candidate for a crosstalk, and you got the one coil and then you've got another coil right next to it, yes, they're going to bleed into each other because they'll interact. But It's not simply about the bleeding in. You can do that just by stereo narrowing everything. That's not hard. It's mixing. Literally, it's mixing. So the bleeding into each other is not the thing. A coil has a sound. It's like making a plugin, which is another thing that I should be doing, calculating and measuring and making a plugin that does a really good job of doing a transformer. Other people are doing that now. I should be getting off my butt and doing that myself. And coils have behaviors that are really significant. Like they'll saturate the core, they'll resonate in different frequencies and in different ways. They'll do all manner of different stuff. And the way coils interact with things, it's like if you have a single coil guitar pickup versus a double coil guitar pickup. You have your single coil and it's like 7K impedance. And then you'll have your double coil, which is a classic, say, humbucker from Gibson. And that's maybe 11K impedance. Actually, no, more like 8. More like 8 or 9K for one of the really old ones. And if you do that, you've got the different pickup. It's slightly more high impedance, but it sounds completely different. It sounds completely different from the single coil pickup. That's what the crosstalk thing in things like head stacks means. It means that you have coils, and coils are part of the sound, but the coils are not in a simple configuration of just all by themselves. Instead, they're adjacent to other coils. They interact. It's affecting the way the inductance and all of that kind of stuff works. And you can't have them work as if they are standalone, if they're packed together that tightly. And part of the sound, it's not about whether the channels are getting audio into each other. It's the fact that you're looking at, effectively, a part of the signal path. It's acting like, say, a guitar pickup or something. And the adjacence of the other channels, the other tracks, means that your tape head starts acting more like a humbucker Gibson pickup than it does like a Strat pickup. You get a distinctly different tone because of the way that the isolated little coil works. And you'd be able to have that whether or not the channels were literally talking to each other. So that would be my take on the crosstalk issue, which has been coming up for like over a decade now. People have been talking about this forever. But that's the thing. It's not about whether you're sending audio. And remember, audio comes in buffers in a DAW, so you can't really have the buffers talking to each other because we're only calculating one at a time. It becomes very cumbersome and very CPU crunching to try to store up. You'd maybe take an entire buffer's worth of everything and talk everything to everything else in a sample by sample basis. Your performance would absolutely die. And then, unless you're completely cheating, which is kind of like, okay, well then cheat intelligently. And as the performance completely dies, you also get twice as much latency as you would otherwise have. So it's just a loser all the way across. And the things you get with analog stuff that has crosstalk issues, there's a lot of stuff besides just the audio leaking into other audio. In fact, I think it's all about the stuff that's not audio leaking into other audio. I think it's all about the power supply interdependency. And some of that can be done by just doing stuff that relates to the mix bus itself. You can do stuff where, say, if you have one bay of a big recording console and it has its own power supplies so that it chokes if a single channel starts drawing too much, you could put a plugin that mimics that by putting it on a submix with just that stuff in there. And then on the submix, what you do is you have whatever processing you're doing, and it's looking for high energy stuff, and if it hits the high energy stuff, it starts grabbing power supply energy out of the modeling. And by the same token, the adjacent coils as part of a mimicking of a transformer or something like an interstage thing, that can be done on a channel by channel basis. It doesn't have to involve having channels literally bleed into each other, because the effect of that is always going to be essentially just stereo narrowing, and in some cases sort of averaging and blurring. It'll make stuff darker, but I have better ways of making stuff darker. So yeah. So, looking back up over some stuff. 100% brick wall filter, high pass and low pass plugin. Probably can't do that for you. That's a different kind of plugin than the kinds I make that sound good. Brick wall filters, if you want that, I would suggest if you're on Mac, I'm using an old program called Brick, and that does a pretty good brick wall low pass. As far as brick wall high pass says, I don't know about that. The thing about biquads is you can use lots of them in series to steepen the angle, or you can increase the Q, which also steepens the angle but makes resonance. And you can dial those in by tone rather than just sticking to, say, Butterworth. Butterworth is a particular filter coefficient that means that there is no boost going into the cut. And then you start adding more Q and you start having a boost going into the cut, and you can go as high as you want that way. Honestly, some of the things I'm likely to do, for instance, I've got some new stuff to do with like 2-tape and various of the bass fattener type things, because the way 2-tape works, it has some DC blocking stuff, because the inherent 2-tape algorithm is not DC stable. So what it'll do is always try to sit with a certain amount of DC, but it'll also have its very characteristic tonality. And I've always had to put a kind of filtration on it. But if I use a biquad high pass for that, what I can do is combine the way that the filter works with the way that the specifically 2-tape head bump code works, which is the same stuff as in Fathom 5 and so on. And that's not simply a filter, that's a whole other thing. But it requires a high pass after it because it will put out DC at some point. And I can combine the two to voice in a tape head bump like effect that can be dialed up as much as you want, and it will have a really good, full, interesting sound, but it'll also cut the DC stuff away really well. I should be able to combine those two things by replacing what I'm using as a high pass with a suitably well-designed Airwindows style IIR high pass, at which point I'd be able to go, okay, let's give it a higher Q, and you'd start having a little bit of a resonance at the very lowest area, and I can use that to stretch the deepest lows out, and just sort of, in doing that, I'd basically be just tailoring it. I would be designing the tone of it to taste, as well as to tape, by using the high pass cutoff. And the nice thing about it is if I do that, that also steepens the cutoff after that slightly resonant bottom. So yeah, in fact, it could be possible to do that with one of the band passes and just have it so that it's, well, it probably would be. It's hard to tell. Honestly, it does make a certain amount of sense to, back already. I would be nice to Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves is super cool. Keanu Reeves is my kind of person. And he's breathtaking. But it may very well be that the 2-tape head bump code will end up being a form of bandpass. And it's also possible, depending upon the way it works or depending upon what else I need to do with it, that the head bump code could also be in high pass form with the resonant peak at the bottom, depending upon how much highs I need to let through. Because if I do a high pass, it'll not block any of the highs. If I do a band pass, it becomes just only head bump content to be added, and it'll also be fairly tightly localized. I might want it to be a little broader. That's the way of it. Is part of the sound of the 2-tape head bump code is that if you push it harder, if you put high energy into it, it'll start saturating. The super low stuff will bloom out and be very deep and reinforced, but then as you push it higher, you'll start getting some overtones. You'll start even getting a slightly distorty effect. And in so doing, that means I wouldn't want to just have it be a resonant bandpass as the way of controlling the DC that algorithm generates. Because if I do it using a high pass, I can accentuate the lows wherever I want them. I'd probably want to do a bunch of research, because when I do this kind of stuff, sometimes what takes the time is I'm spending days on end digging into anything that I can find, internet research-wise, but measurements of like volume and phase and stuff of actual tape recordings and how they compare to each other. You look at people who are doing, working with recording tapes, and when they're comparing tapes to other tapes, that's usually when you get the good information. It's not the ones that are comparing tapes to digital audio. It's usually the ones that are trying to nail down, which tape am I going to get the best low end for my platinum selling band that I'm buying the tape for because we're going into the studio, And those are the guys that are paying close attention. Those are the guys that are also kind of up a creek in many ways, because it's harder to get analog tape these days. People are still making it, I think, but it became harder and harder to get your hands on that stuff. So, and the thing about the head bump behavior is that you can really get a useful effect out of using that algorithm. It needs to have a DC block because it tends to have DC floating around. I can use a resonance to sort of accentuate the very deepest of the lows. That works very well. But if it's simply a high pass rather than a band pass, it's not wiping out all of the harmonics that the algorithm does generate, much like any of my distortion algorithms. Because part of what's going on there is that algorithm produces some harmonics out of just the low-end head bump stuff, and that makes it sound more analog-y rather than just being, if it's simply an EQ, you won't get any overtones. You've got your 60 hertz thing, you won't get any 120 hertz, you won't get any 240 hertz. But if you're using something that's a little nonlinear or real analog tape, you're probably going to get those things if you push it hard enough to start causing saturation. There's a lot of interesting stuff to pay attention to. That's one of the reasons I've had like 5 different versions of 2-tape since I started. So yeah, I'm going to show you something weird, seeing as we're getting into our second hour. Check this out. What do you think of this? Firstly, what do you think it is? This is a aerodynamic device. And then I'm going to tell you some of the stuff that I do later on today, hopefully without too much getting badgered by birds invading my stove. I like putting these on my car because I'm trying to improve the fuel mileage of my car, much in the same way that I was talking to some of you guys about leaning in the direction of vegetarianism on the basis of eating meat is incredibly inefficient. Driving a car that gets bad fuel mileage is also inefficient. And I've got a pretty decent one. My ordinary Subaru Impreza base level. As much as I like the WRXs, they don't get as good fuel mileage, and this one has the CVT. I like putting these on. They work in such a way as like this. So here's your car. If your car is driving along, air is going to blow over it, and that's part of the resistance of air. It does look like an aqueduct, doesn't it? And the air will go over here, and then it'll go over the top of it. It's a sedan style, so it's not a hatchback. And then it'll go here and turn into turbulence. And the turbulence is kind of like big bursts of air all over the place. It makes noise inside the cabin. You'll hear a rumble from the air turning around. And this turbulence causes drag. So what you'd really want is a long, skinny tail, a sort of teardrop thing where it's like... And there have been cars like that. They're crazy race car type things. But there's another way to do it, and this actually does work. I've been using this for some years now. And it's these folks who started doing it. You can see the label. And it says AirTab Fuel Saver. You can probably read that, maybe not. And they go kind of like this. They're on the car like that. The pointy end is towards the back rather than towards the front. You can see that it's an area that sticks up, and the front end is like a scoop, so it might make a little bit more sense. It doesn't look like that's how you do it, but it is. And as the car is moving this direction, it's going this way along the trailing edge of the vehicle, and air comes in this way and turns into two sort of swirls coming off of it. It's a fairly large... These are designed for trucks. Trucks can get fairly significant boosts in fuel mileage if they do this kind of thing. You have to be willing to stick them all over the back of your truck's cargo, the big rectangular boxy area. Although you can also put them in other places as well. But it causes these two swirls because it's like a scoop that's making swirls like this. And as a result of that, the airflow gets turned into a more laminar flow and is more smooth, trailing off. There are pictures of these things in use in all kinds of funny ways. Like, there is a picture of a Porsche race car, which is not really that much of a race car. It's more like one of those little coupe versions, not super powerful, but it had a cabin with an edge on the back that was kind of like this. It was a little too sharp. And so what would happen is this fast Porsche going along, there would be a big turbulent area behind here, and it would be kind of lifting the back of the car up, and it would get all squirrely and stuff. So they would put them at the edge on the top of the cabin just before it does its little drop. And there's a picture of such a car racing at top speed through a sort of barrier of mist. And you can literally see it going through the mist or going through whatever water vapor or whatever it was, and literally see the airflow smoothly going down past this area and merging. It is a technology that actually works. So I've stuck these things all over my hapless Subaru. And here's the deal. I think I had too many, because you also get additional friction, air friction, from having this stuff sticking out. There's a correct amount to use, and I think I went too far. So I've been taking them off of the sides of my car and leaving them on the back. You space them about this tightly together, maybe a little farther apart. And they're sort of on the back of the trunk where it just chops off, going to the back of the car. And they're stuck on with this stuff that you sort of peel it off, stick it on, and it's going to be there. You're not going to get it off anytime soon. And it's a sort of rubbery material. As you can see, it's kind of spongy. And it doesn't want to come off. So if you do want to take these off, you're going to be really sad. And that's kind of where I've been at, is I've been kind of really sad about wanting to clean this back up again. So what I'll be doing this afternoon is as follows. You need to heat this stuff up in order to remove it. I pulled a bunch of these off, the ones that I wanted to remove, on a super, super hot day when it was like over 90. And it was so hot that some of them had started to sort of come away a little bit anyway. And this stuff got really sort of squishy, although it was still stuck on real good, but that's what you do, is you heat it up. So I pulled these things off, and here they are. Here's a couple of them. And I still got the ones that are in the correct places. And what I will be doing next is taking out a hairdryer in as hot as I can. It's going to be like over 80 at least, so this is one of my last chances. And taking the hairdryer, heating this stuff up, and scraping it off with the truss rod cover from that Samick SG over there, because that's what this is. This is the truss rod cover to the Samick SG. And I will be scraping off what remains on the surface of the car's hapless plastic bits. I don't get more views about this, don't worry about it. If you have plugin questions, by all means, ask them, and I'll try to answer them. And then once you've scraped off most of the stuff after heating it up, what you do is you take some WD-40 and you scrape some more. And it still doesn't really do it. So after that, you just have removed as much of the stuff as you possibly can. And then you buy some spray paint and you paint over the mess that you've made. So that's going to be like the rest of my afternoon, I'm afraid. I'll be doing that in about 40 minutes. In about 40 or 45 minutes or so, as long as it's still a hot day, because it's looking like it's going to be another hot day, and I need that in order to do this particular work. As soon as it gets cold, it'll be much harder. And yeah, all of this stuff. You know, I did dive very deeply into digital audio for a while there. And I don't want to remove the side mirrors. If I want better aero, I use them. I could get smaller ones, I suppose, but I do use them. I like them. Pan law is an interesting question for me, because I'm pretty much sold on LCR mixing. In LCR mixing, pan law is not really a thing. What you'll be doing... Oh, I can tell you what pan law is, though, if that would help. If that feels a little bit more like an audio-related thing. I'll just grab another piece of paper for this. So, pen pot. Here's what pan law is about. And that's interesting. I'm not quite sure what Pekore is saying there. I'm assuming people are asking what pan law is about. Here's the deal. If you've got audio that is in the center, or you've got audio that is left, or you've got audio that is right, you just got audio on this track and you're picking out where it's going to go. Turn it to full left. You've got the audio cranking away at full left. Turn it to full right. You've got audio cranking away at the full right. That should be the same volume. If you put it to the middle, how loud does each channel go? That's what pan law is about. Because you could say, okay, so attenuate the one channel completely, attenuate the other channel completely. If you're in the middle, both of them should be at full volume. You've just made the track a good, 6 dB louder? And that doesn't normally work for people. People don't normally like to have panning from one side to the other. You should ask the question about mastering again, because I think I might have missed it. I can scroll up just a second. Oh, and I never did look at the conversation. Oh, no, wait, there you are. There you are. Oh, you're asking what are the best? That's a dangerous question. Yeah, the reason I think I didn't see that is because that's a dangerous question and difficult to ask and more difficult to answer. I'm going to ask you to clarify before I answer that, as in what are you specifically doing? At least tell me the genre. At least tell me what genre you're in. Now, while we're at it, oh, interesting. Okay, so people are not asking specifically what Panlaw is. You're asking what Fruity Loop Studio does with stereo tracks in Panlaw. There's a thing, because I don't use Fruity Loop Studio, and I do not know why they would have it do that. So that's a little concerned. So that was the question for Kevin. Kevin, you need to tell me what genre you want to talk about mastering in before I can even begin to answer that question. I might be able to, but that's one of the things where it becomes an unanswerable question. Because especially in mastering, it's conditional upon what you're being handed. Some of the best mastering is do nothing, do no harm. So, yeah. The Fruity Loops thing, I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer because I have never observed Fruity Loops doing it because I've not actually used it. I could try to ask why you might do such a thing. Okay, Kevin is actually giving good information here. So, cool. We're getting a whole pile. I can run around answering, start shooting off questions like mad and bugging me about them, and we'll spend the last half hour actually answering real questions about plugins and audio. So, Kevin, I will answer your question a couple of ways, because one of the ways is, are you making dub plates? Are you mastering to vinyl or having somebody else handle the mastering to vinyl? Because there's a bunch of real specific things about that, and it's relevant. Bo is going back to actual Panlaw. So the way Panlaw works is you don't want them both to go to full volume, and you don't necessarily want them to each go full volume, half volume off, because that might make it a little too quiet in the middle. I think that's how that works. So pan law means to what extent does stuff that gets panned to the center get made to be louder? And the reason I'm not interested in pan law is that I'm a lot more interested in LCR mixing and having 3 buses. So as is usual, I have my own ideas about how things are supposed to be done. And my concept doesn't really involve things traveling from channel to channel, unless perhaps you're doing them as a stereo effect, in which case you're working with a stereo track, in which case you're working with LR. So yeah. So here's the thing about dub reggae, at least old school, and also dub techno, which I'm very familiar with because I'm a big fan of that genre, is it's all about the bass, and bass needs to be handled in certain ways to work really well for being effective. Most notably, bass doesn't work very well when heavily stereoized. A lot of the better things that work in bass involve having bass be essentially down the center. So, in terms of doing, I can give you a couple of suggestions, and some of them are monitoring related suggestions. So this is not telling you what to do sonically to your sound, but it is telling you some things that you can do to get more of a handle on what's happening there. You should grab the plugins subs only and slew only, and check your mixes using those. They're not really there to be put into a mix and used as part of the mix. What you do is you put them temporarily onto the whole output, and they're set up and calibrated in such a way that if you have a full mix, you're listening to it and it's going at a certain amount, a certain volume level and stuff. If you kick in subs only, you're going to hear only the deepest of bass, just nothing but rumble as if it's from 2 blocks away. And it's also going to be kind of distorted and weird and interesting, and it's also going to be at a characteristic volume level. If you switch in slew only, then that is going to give you only the highs, and it is also calibrated in such a way that it's going to give you a particular volume level. And if you're doing anything dub reggae, dub techno oriented, so that your deepest bass matters, you're not going to get anywhere with dub reggae style stuff if you're lacking in bass. You're going to want it to have that real weight behind it in some way or shape or form. But what's going to happen when you monitor stuff through subs only, or slew only, is you will get a perspective on how loud your various elements are relative to each other, and how the track sounds when you're listening to only those extreme categories. And what's going to happen if you've got your mix working right is when you kick in subs only, it's going to be louder. Your extreme lows are going to be huge, and they're going to go louder than just the regular unaltered mix. And you're going to hear a balance of your low frequency elements in such a way that it'll still make sense, that it'll still sound basically right. It's not going to become just dominated by the bass and you have no kick, or dominated by the kick and you have nothing else. And likewise, if you are doing slew only, you're going to lose all the bass, you're going to lose everything, and you're going to be hearing extremely bright high frequency sound, and it's not going to be louder than the regular audio. It's going to step back just a bit. It's hopefully not going to vanish away completely unless you want a really dark, murky kind of thing. And that's cool. If you do, I like those too. But probably if you kick in slew only, everything is going to get quieter. You're going to hear only the high frequency stuff. And it's probably not going to be fatiguing, wearying, or overly, it's not going to sound busy. Because one of the key things about mixing or mastering a dub style reggae, dub techno kind of thing is you're going to need to have a lot of space in the sound. You're going to want a lot of depth. It's going to be all about the bass. And the highs shouldn't dominate and shouldn't fatigue you. Now, there are variations on, like, dancehall, I think, reggae, where it's going to get a lot busier, it's going to get a lot more techno-y, and it's going to get a lot more aggressive. But when you're talking dub, I'm thinking, like, echoes and space and reverb and bass and stuff like that, and it's just stuff that you can wallow in. You can just sort of lay back, and it's one of my favorite genres, frankly. The dub techno stuff just makes it for me all day long. And that's why if you do those mix check plugins, you're going to find that the bass one, subs only, gives you a really big, noticeably louder result that should still balance and make sense. You should like what it's doing down there when you can only hear what's down there. And then on the high frequency one, slew only, you do that, it is calibrated. A pop song should probably have all of those be about the same. Like a pop song that's supposed to be just like zippy and energetic and all that kind of stuff. What you're going to have is you kick in subs only, and it's going to be doing things, and it's still going to make sense, but it's not going to dominate. And then with the slew only, it's going to be as loud as everything, as loud as it was previously, and probably rather busy, and it's going to be interesting and have a lot going on, not be too spiky, not be too dense. And the thing with a dub track is you're going to have it be, it's going to be mellower. It's going to be more relaxed. it's not going to be so full of high frequency energy and stuff. And when it is, it's you'll know why. It's like, oh, that's that cool hi-hat part that I want in there. But that's the gist of it. Before I get busy talking about something else, let me go and have a quick look at something. I want to go to, and David has a really good point there as far as not mastering your own stuff. That's something that people often end up being, I would say, stuck with. But cooperating with other people is often very useful. I'm checking on the fellow on the Gearslutz thread. The other fellow was like, oh, did you not post a Gearslutz? And I did. And then somebody said, is there any chance you'll ever make a more competitive plugin? And I'd really like to know what they mean by that. Because in many ways, I'm doing what I need to do. And I'm very interested in whether they're perceiving something that I could easily incorporate, or whether what they want is stuff that doesn't work for me. And I don't know until they tell me. So, people posting saying, no, you're not, your post is wrong in so many ways. What do you mean when you say you could make amazing plugins? I love this stuff. It's like, it's nice for people coming to my defense and stuff, but I do actually want to know what they meant. Because it is possible that they're like, I understand the way in which you could do such sophisticated, complicated things if you just had graphics and knobs and designed your own interface. And it could be an expression of believing in me and thinking that I could do wonderful stuff with that, which I probably could. So I'm looking for that answer. I'm looking for them to answer what they meant by it. Maybe that's a private message. No. No, it's a friend who's griping at me about something. Yeah, so another friend was like, I want you to do this. And I want to do this, and I want to do that, and stuff. And they've basically invented a sort of unusual form of compressor. So it's like, and I want you to do that thing. And it's like, I don't necessarily do the thing. I do the thing that comes to my mind. So, okay, Pecori, what's OTT? I don't recognize that acronym. Quick, before another bird falls into my stove, answer me what OTT is. And I probably don't need my PAN-law thing. Lols and OTT. Am I missing something in the conversation? Meanwhile, this is my idea for what a PAN-law is you don't have one. Instead, your stereo stuff works as stereo stuff, and your actual mixing is left, center, or right, and a bunch of stuff goes in center. And you're thinking in terms of 3 buses rather than 2, and I am like, oh no, a multi-band compressor. Oh no. Let me look that up. And I remember the Betterizer or something. People have talked about that. Oh, is that what over the top? Splicecom is doing a free recreation of a popular aggressive multi-band upwards-downwards compressor used by dubstep and electro producers. That's interesting. Can someone explain like I'm 5 what an OTT multi-band compressor does? Stands for over the top. All the EDM guys use it. No, they don't. I promise you they don't. So people are talking about it. Instead of 1 limiter turning your sound into an audio brick, you have 3 limiters that turn your respective frequency bands into a brick. We're going to have some words here. That's a really terrible idea. Don't do that. Mind you, I like some stuff in those veins, but the reason that I'm generally so tired of it and will not listen to it willingly uh, very much is because some genres do tend to, they like to lean in that direction. And you can't. It doesn't work. I've got a multiband distortion. You can try to use that. Maybe that'll be fun. Also, there's another thing about this kind of stuff is if you make it, put it this way, and I could make one as a joke, I suppose. If you do something like that and you have it be like a just one knob pre-built sound betterizer kind of thing, you could have a bunch of people being very excited about it. And it's not a good thing. It's like wrecking sounds by making them different in a characteristic way. And this is nothing to do to people, and it's just generally a bad idea. Everything that I've made entire plugins, like, trying to remember that one. I should remember the name of this because I'll probably be doing more stuff like this in future. The frustration. Let's look at my list of plugins. I know I released it for VST, so it's going to be in there somewhere. Dum-de-dum. Looking through here, trying to find the thing. Righteous. The whole purpose of doing a plugin like Righteous is to have it be pretty much literally the opposite of a multi-band limiter / compressor. It goes literally the opposite direction, forces you to go in a different direction. And everything that I've done in terms of working with sound and everything that I've done in terms of learning about mixing and stuff flies in the face of that stuff. And I see people more and more going in this direction, and I feel that it is just leading the audio world in this like preset-oriented soloing stuff and getting it to sound quote-unquote amazing and solo-oriented. Like, people are missing out on so much by falling into these traps, and I do consider them to be traps, and I won't willingly support them. Because what's going on when you take an individual track like drums or keyboards or something like that, or your this synth or that synth or something like that, and you put your OTT on it and you multiband it and you flange it and you splunchulate it and you do these various things where it's like, okay, now that one has all the bass hit and all of the treble glitter and all of the this and that, and none of the funny bits are poking out, and everything is blended together so that it sounds completely complete all on its own. Let's go and do the next one. And you wind up with an enormous pile of stuff that's all been massaged into this gray paste. Smush it all together and then over-loudinate it. And you wind up with just extruded flour. It's like extruded paste of no character or quality whatsoever. Nothing specifies anything. It's all just generically, full range and high detail and blah, 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 blah. But you can't do that. It doesn't work that way. You got to make decisions as far as where stuff sits in a mix. You do interesting things. You do stuff like Peter Gabriel has done over all those solo albums, where you'd have really quirky, weird mixes, funny decisions, things that are being done that stick out, that are surprising to hear. There's always been lots of that in pop hits, in general. And especially as we get closer to being able to have computers intelligently analyze stuff and be able to do that equalizing everything out really effectively. And we have digital limiters that are able to dynamically really equalize stuff out very effectively. All of these things are like powerful weapons in various ways, but they can be grossly misused, and it's just you're just asking for your stuff to be ignored. It's a deadly problem. It's a big problem having people dive into this kind of stuff. And I've seen good people do it. I've seen naive people do it. I'm not going to say that I perfectly avoid it because, of course, there's always the value of the song. I could put together something where it's like, hey, this sound has the right kind of resonances here, and then this one fills in this area over here, and then I've got this element which is filling in high frequencies, and all of it is combining into a really neat sound picture of dissonant hell and horrible ugly noises, because I like those too. So it's not a guarantee that you're going to make great music just because you're making mixing choices that don't involve massaging everything into a gray paste. But given the choice, it's really important, and this is one of the things I'm going to be excited about when, probably in 2 or 3 months. It's probably going to be 2 or 3 months before this happens, but eventually I'm going to hit that $1,500 a month point. And at that point, I'm going to be doing the Wednesday stream as well as the Monday and Tuesday stream. Because part of what I'm offering for the Patreon thing is you kind of say, like, okay, if you give me more money, I'll give you more stuff. I'll give you more time out of my day. Because goodness knows I have enough of that, right? And one of the things I'll be doing is going over these classic vinyl records in their original form. The stuff that made the impression on people. The stuff that had things last over the years. And you won't necessarily hear those things anymore. These days what you get, and I've seen some very interesting, shall I say, often you'd like to be nice to people, and you're dealing in the music industry and you're a producer or some kind of mixer or a software developer like me, so you got to be nice to other people. You got to get along. Well, sometimes stuff turns up where you see the same people who have lots of experience and know how to be nice, and they're just like, oh no, this will not stand. Oh man, I am just disgusted. It makes me want to throw up. This is horrible. And here is... Oh, didn't Purist Air already come out as VST? I think it did. I suppose I could be mistaken. I think it did. Here, let me have a quick look. If it didn't, that's another thing that I should follow up on. Quick look. PQRS. You're absolutely right. Let me write that down. Depaprio Biswas. You shall have Purist Air as VST. That is an oversight. Expect that in the next couple of months. You're absolutely right. That is not available as VST. And although it is very similar to Energy and all like that, yeah, there's no reason it shouldn't exist. So you shall have it. You shall have it. This is one of the reasons having a live stream is useful. Stuff can get by me. And it didn't occur to me that I had left that one out. So here's the thing. I want to show people what some of these original vinyl records and the mixes off of them were really like. You need to hear it. You need to hear what that stuff actually was, because you're not. These days, what you're hearing is not simply just the legacy of decades of stuff being out as CD, and stuff has not always been done well as CD. But stuff gets remade and redone and remixed and done over and remastered, and they try to sell the CDs over and over again. And every step of the way, they're taking this stuff that made a huge impression back in the day. And it made a huge impression because it was sonic art. Oh, it would make noises if I tried hard enough to. It's a limp little cable, a headphone cable. You can hear it making some noises. Don't worry about it. But some of these mixes of classic rock type stuff, because that's mostly what I'm going to be paying attention to. It's the stuff that sold millions and millions of copies back in the day when that was a pretty big deal. And before the 80s and 90s and stuff, where sheer marketing and record company force took over as far as pushing the millions of records through. This is back when it was still kind of consumer driven and people were seeking out and trying to get stuff. And everybody was a little bit more naive, and they allowed things to go a certain way. So I discovered on one of these sort of heavyweight sound engineer forums from some of the big names from back in the day, put together their little forums in different places in the internet. And somebody mentioned that there was a remix of Abbey Road. And people were losing their minds. And I'll tell you why. The reason they were losing their minds is that Abbey Road is a damn masterpiece. It is a fantastic mix. It is wonderful. Granted, it is the first one that was entirely a transistor mix. And this is the kind of stuff I'll be talking about on these live streams, to the extent that I am allowed to do it, because it's always possible that I'll play the wrong record and somebody will be like, banned! And they'll try to knock the stream off or remove it from, because I'll be keeping them for archival purposes, but I can't guarantee that they'll stay. So it's possible that record companies will snipe my stuff, so you'll have to show up for the Wednesdays, and we will see whether the record companies, if they're getting really picky about it, are able to kill a live stream in flight. We will find out. But there is a remix indeed coming out of Abbey Road by Giles Martin. Note, not George Martin. Not the guy who is actually involved in it. No. His kid. I believe it is his kid. And the people that I saw say that it is a damned insult and excruciatingly bad. If it sounds great to you, it's because you're too used to modern CD stuff. And that's the White Album. What are you even talking about? And people need to understand this. You're not understanding this. You've been listening to too many louderizers and over-the-top compressors and multi-band limiters. Yeah, Abbey Road is an 8-track machine on a transistor desk. It was the first use of the transistor desk in the Beatles' recording history. White Album was still being done on a tube desk. You know, there's a fellow who's doing remixes with all kinds of reverence even of a lot of the classic Jethro Tull and Yes albums of my childhood. And I have been buying those things and just ripping the raw transfer of the original mix, because these particular ones also include that. The prog rock stuff tends to include a flat transfer of the original mix, and that's the only part that I want. So I'm just getting these things in order to do that. When they remix them, they're not as good. These things are not as good as the way they did them for a variety of reasons. And one of the reasons is, like everything that I do with my plugins is for a purpose. And it is answering a need. And there is a ethic behind it. And if you think that my stuff sounds better than other people, there's a reason for that. I'm following a direction. That direction was naturally present in lots of these original recordings. And when I play the audio on them, on stream, from the original vinyl, using a fancy turntable that I basically designed myself, I won't say it's perfect, but it's pretty fancy, you'll hear how different that is. And it will be my job to teach you why that matters. Some of this stuff is going to sound weirdly dark. It's going to sound quieter than you're used to. It's not going to sound like a radio station anymore. It's not going to sound upfront. It's not going to sound bright. I could play, and may very well end up playing, Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, and I could play something like The Chain, and it will take your head off with how intense it is. But if you measure it, and I've also shown measurements of these things too, if you measure it, you will see that it's all peak energy, and all of the intensity of that is this halo of peak energy coming off of the performances. They don't do stuff like that anymore. All of these remixes being done today of all this classic stuff is all about modern production techniques. And they're all going to do stuff like, oh, let's see whether John Lennon is much better if we compress him 24 dB and then de-ess him a little bit, but give him a nice, like, Steven Slate virtual mix rack boost here. And and it's going to be a mess. Even if they have a certain degree of taste about it, the basic concept of what's being done is a complete mess. And the people who were reacting to the Abbey Road remixes being planned are the people who were there. They were like one of the guys who was responding. He wasn't too scathing. There were people that were more scathing. But one of the people who were responding with kind of horror at all of this is a friend of mine named Terry. And that's the guy that did ZZ Top Eliminator and a bunch of the other classic ZZ Top albums. And that's the guy who engineered Led Zeppelin frickin' 3. Have you ever heard the Immigrant Song? Dun, 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 dun. He did that. Led Zeppelin did that. He engineered that. The way it sounds is because Terry made it be that way. This is the guy who's horrified at the idea that they're going to do Abbey Road over again for modern audiences. I think it's possible that there could be remixes and remasters that could be good. But that is not the way things are being made today. Bringing things into like modern audience type stuff, there's a reason all of this has gone to hell recently. The music industry can't support people anymore. And there are ways to do it today. Why do you think I've been making all of these plugins? You would be doing it with plugins, but you would approach it in a different way. If I'm able to do this Wednesday stream and start analyzing these records, you'll see a very passionate Chris. And you can argue with me if you want. That'll be fine. I have no problem with being iconoclastic or having not everybody agree with everything. But you'll notice that there is a consistency to my takes on some of these things. And you were able to do these things with plugins just as easily as they did them back in the day. In fact, one of the things I'd like to start doing, I have more plans. Here's a plan. This is a plan for, I want to trade a bunch of my instruments in for a Fender Mustang bass that I found in a local guitar shop. I hope it's still there. If not, I'll just have to wait for another one. But I have an idea for rewiring the pickups in such a way that I can use the ones they give you usefully. And I want to get into tracking a more rock-oriented music, but doing it using the stuff that I've learned and using the approach that was done back in the day, back in those days when you had these incredible, incredible classic albums. Because it's funny, it's like there's a lot going on. I think that in many cases, people enjoy some kinds of recordings, whether they be electronic, rock, or whatever. People like having those things with the sense of scale and just a general bigness that makes it feel as if you're being played to by music that is in a space and has some real size and scope. Unfortunately, even back in the day, if they had recorded onto magical, perfect audio recording that had no losses and just gave you back exactly what you put in, then a lot of stuff would be a little too upfront. It wouldn't mesh, it wouldn't glue, it wouldn't come together the way that some of that stuff does. And that's essentially what we have today. When people say, oh, digital is perfect sound forever, well, it's been a long time coming. But if you do say, I would say even so far, you could do Q sound, but Q sound is a physical property. Q sound is basically dummy head binaural. What you do is you get a dummy head and you put microphones in the ears and then you make ears around it and you record stuff to that. That's how they did it. I think that's the holophonics thing. The Zuccarelli or whoever it is. Remember, if I start doing this Wednesday stuff, I'll be able to fill up a good really amount of time just dumping this information for you. Because there's a lot of it out there and I've spent decades upon decades learning it all. But to get back to the thing about the, in my last 3 minutes or so, to get back to the thing about those classic albums, I think people enjoy hearing certain styles of music that sounds as if it's big, like it's on stage, like you're in the audience or in a place where this band is blasting away at you or playing more comfortably at you. And when you close mic everything up and record it with like perfect technology, and honestly, I think that you do 24-bit 96K recordings and then don't mess it up, and you've basically got that. That is enough to reasonably do audio capture that you're not going to be sad about, that is not going to be wrong or bad. And then what you do with it, that becomes the interesting thing. Because back in the day, they had stuff going on where the recording equipment itself blended and merged that stuff into a cohesive picture that really worked for people, that really sounded good. And in the digital area, you got to do it yourself. So yeah, my perspective on gain staging and psychoacoustics is what I would be talking about on Wednesdays. Because it's best done in the perspective of studying a particular album and going, this is what you do to get the Who sound. This is what you do to get like Dark Side of the Moon this is how they put that together. This is what you do to thus and so on. And David, the thing about the in-ears is I don't believe in-ears are good to mix on. I would quite like to have in-ears for just sort of enjoyment purposes or for times like this when I'm doing a, live stream kind of thing. Have a little like smaller microphone and stuff and set it up. I don't think in-ears or any headphones really are a great idea for doing mixing and mastering on exclusively because you are not getting the experience of the sound in the room, which is pretty critical. So it can lead you astray very easily, and there's not much that you can do to stop that. Although you could use the plugins that I mentioned earlier, subs only and slew only, to at least get a sort of focus on areas. Have I talked about the... I might run a little over just to talk about this. And quick answer, Olkheim, if I'm mispronouncing you, correct me, because I've been saying that for like weeks. Having stuff be a little bit more mono is certainly a thing. I mean, heck, some of the Creedence songs are literally mono and stereo. Proud Mary is literally mono. They put everything in mono and they were like, oh, wait, did we have anything in stereo here? No? Oops. And as far as the transformers and coils next to each other being involved with each other, again, this is not about channels putting their audio into other channels. It's about what's happening to the individual channel as the environment that it's in. It's like the difference between a humbucker and a single coil pickup on guitars. Elohim? All right. Is that right, Elohim? So that's an O rather than just a degree, and it's a... Okay. I'll try to remember that as best I can. Correct me if I don't. As far as the in-ears being molded to rear perfectly, that has nothing to do with the fact that over-ear headphones or any isolating headphone or indeed any headphone at all, even open ears, are directly producing a sound in your ear with no room involvement. And normally listening to music has room involvement. So it's easier to get an accurate picture of exactly what's on there, but here's what's going to happen. And maybe this works. This might work better for Whitesea because of some choices he's making I don't agree with. The thing is, if all of your sound is just squished into a gray paste, so all you're doing is balancing the levels of them, then headphones will give you an accurate picture of how those things combine. And the end result is going to be incredibly uninspiring and bad. Bad in my opinion. If you have stuff that I actually like, the things that people have been working against for years, like this amazing guitar note, it just, jumps out because it has an incredibly high resonance and it's 36 dB of resonance at a particular frequency very cleanly without anything else happening, and then it's gone. If you have that going on in your mix, so you've got that one really ear-catching guitar note or whatever, that and it's being done through intense resonances that are not suppressed, constrained, or anything like that, and you've got that in headphones, it's going to get right by you. You're not really going to perceive how much louder it is than everything else because your ears will shut down. Your ears react to loudness in a characteristic way. This is really, really important. So, I wouldn't be surprised if Whitesea was sponsored by the In-Ear Company. He's a very clever fellow. Here's where that gets you. You almost have to smoosh everything into toothpaste in order to be able to work that way, because if you have intense, clean resonances of the kind that sound amazing and that catch people's ears, then you're like, oh wow, that voice just went right through me for a moment. And it's being presented over incredibly good in-ears, so they're not distorting, they're not breaking up or screwing up in any way. They're presenting to you exactly what you've got. Your ear will shut down on that peak. Remember, it's a peak. And since your ear shuts down on the peak, it's going to go through to the final mix and you will not hear it. That's a big problem. And if you have speakers in a room, then that resonant thing, it's going to burst through the speakers. Hopefully it's not going to distort those either. And maybe you won't hear it the first time around, but then it bounces off the back wall and hits you again. And then it bounces off the other wall and hits you again. And you're going to notice when there are wonderful, intense, resonant, soulful bits popping out that you might indeed really want to be happening because it's on speakers in an acoustic environment, and you're going to notice when stuff like that pops out. So that is the reason why headphones can be a terrible mistake if you're relying upon them. Nobody's ears can avoid shutting down when high volume stuff bursts out. So nobody is able to correctly mix transients or intense resonant peaks in a mix if they're using only headphones. I don't care who you are, I don't care what the headphones are, unless I suppose maybe if they're really terrible so they distort. That might work, but it would be sad. It would be awful. Maybe I should make headphones like that. I'll make headphones that distort super easily, and then you'd be able to hear it. But it's a basic concept. So that's basically the idea there is it all kind of goes together. If everybody works only on headphones and everybody smushes all of their audio into a great pace so that there are never any transients, so there's never any resonant peaks, there's never any of that. Everybody does like soothe and all this other, whatever the other kinds of things are. I get really negative on soothe and I don't mean to, but it's serving a purpose that directly fights some of the stuff that I like. And if everything happens like that, there's going to be nothing worth hearing. It's going to be just really boring, and there will be no point to doing any of this. So, that said, word of the wise. And yeah, final note here before I say good day to you folks and go off to scrape gunk off of my car from when I've removed these things, and now I have to remove this stuff off of it. Yeah. Pacori is correct that too much stereo is gray paste. And that's also very worth noting. And you really don't want to have kicks be stereo. You really don't want to have bass be stereo. Just don't. Okay, just don't do stereo kicks and bass and such. Oh, goodness. No, you don't want to do that. Live, people will hate you, and it just won't generally work. So, Elohim, practicing. Elohim says, do we have the right kind of plugs to kind of recreate XOver? You got to get the terminology correct, because what you're talking about is crosstalk. It doesn't have much to do with crossovers. Doesn't have much to do with my channel plugins and such. And pretty much I'm going to say, like, I have very strong opinions about this, and you can trust me on them, in which case you would be looking for, like, how can I get the sound of actual consoles without worrying about how channels bleed into other channels? Because I'm telling you, that's not the secret. It's about what the console sounds like individually, rather than any way of making things communicate with each other. And if you want to dig into that anyhow, then yes, David, I have told you to not do stereo basses and kicks, so knock yourself out. My midside and Edisdim plugins should help you do terrible, terrible things there. But I do think that you have the correct plugins to get what is positive about the situation using plugins in the box. A great deal of this is about choosing to do the right things and understanding what you've got when you've got it. And that's a big deal. That's why I want to do this Wednesday thing of showing you folks what existed back when this stuff was $1 million business and people were able to have careers on it because they were doing stuff that so wowed everybody that they're like, oh my God, my soul has been touched. How often do you feel that these days? Even with some of the greatest stuff that I love the most, you know, there are technical reasons why stuff is not the same. And some of the technical reasons have to do with peak energy versus RMS energy, loudness, compression, and all that kind of stuff. It's been going on for many, many years. I'm looking forward to being able to tell you folks how this stuff was done and what was happening, and to literally show you off of vintage vinyl what existed back then. Because remember, digital audio has a reasonable claim to being good. What it lacks is some of the gluing and the softening elements, and also you got to take care of the quantization stuff a lot. I can't offer all those things over a live stream, but what I can do is play reasonably clean classic vinyl through a counterpoint tube vinyl preamplifier, by the way, so it's a pretty decent piece of kit for the amplification there, directly into your stream using not even the channels I'm going to be using don't even have EQs on them. I'm not using the mixer channels. I'm using aux channels to get the vinyl in there. And when I do that, you will hear what the real audio sounded like back in the day, because digital, even streaming, is not half bad at being able to present to you what's actually there. And you're going to be amazed at what some of this stuff really sounds like. And possibly annoyed at all the clicks and pops and vinyl artifacts, because, you know, that's one of the downsides of having that kind of stuff going on. But I will be able to show you, week in and week out, different classic albums like you've not heard them before. I'm looking into that, and that's the point I'm going to be trying to make. With a bit of luck, it'll even work out fairly well as far as fair use is concerned, because I'm not going to be... I'm not sure, Elohim, that the 720p matters, because my understanding is that YouTube is going to be giving you 118 118K compressed audio no matter what. It's all going to be the same audio track. If that, maybe even. And you realize I have Pakori. I've got almost all the classic Pink Floyd on vinyl. Hope nobody comes and frickin' steals it. I've got, I don't have Piper at the Gates of Dawn. I've got Saucer Full of Secrets, and that's amazing. I've got Amagama, that's amazing. Metal, doubly amazing. All of the amazing. Obscured by Clouds is amazing. Dark Side of the Moon, everybody knows. Wish You Were Here, Animals, The Wall. I don't think I have the final cut, but I've got all of that on classic vinyl. You can hear it on my Wednesday streams if I start doing this kind of thing. And hopefully people will be excited enough about that. The one catch is I'm never going to be doing it in such a way that you could rip the stream and get the music off of it. I'm only going to be playing little bits of stuff and talking all the way through it, because that's sort of the fair use thing. But I will be quiet for as much as maybe even as much as a minute at a time, certainly 30 seconds at a time, and go like, okay, so listen to this. Here's a passage that you should listen to. Listen to what it does when it, listen to this drum thing. Listen to this climax. And I'll play that and then I'll fade it out and talk more. It's part of the fair use thing. I have to be doing it in a teaching context. But you will get to hear it. And there are ways that you can get a hold of that kind of stuff. Like some of those things, there is, for instance, I could be playing you, say, for instance, if I was to play you Jethro Tull's Heavy Horses or Jethro Tull's Aqualung off of vinyl, I could do that, and then you could go out and buy the remix of either of those, which I have done. I have bought the remix of both of those in the nice little sort of book set thing with the DVDs and all that stuff. And what you get is the very nice fellow who's remixing everything to sound more modern. Not super more modern, but he's remixing to sound more modern. I'm not into it. But in those cases, those two releases also contain flat transfers of the original mix. And those are the ones that I want. And I can tell you right now, if you get that, you can listen to those flat transfers, and it does pretty much sound like what the original record sounds like, except for without the pops and clicks and stuff. And it'll sound a lot like the stuff I'm talking about as far as the intensity, the sonority, slight distance, all of that stuff lives on the original masters, even in a sort of flat transfer kind of thing. And you can also take stuff like that and throw a couple of Airwindows plugs on them, and change and darken them and stuff like that. And that could work as well. So basically, you're gonna hopefully like it. I don't know who the hell is talking on my telephone thing. Somebody was leaving a noisy message. I think that's my cue to go off and go about my day. And people asking madly about Buttercomp before I go. Yep. Buttercomp is a compressor. It is 4 compressors. One of them compresses the positive side of the wave, one of them compresses the negative side of the wave, and then they're interleaved. So it's a complicated pile of compressors doing complicated things. And it's a pretty general way of thing. And no, I haven't done a plugin called Click. Maybe I should. With that, I will bid you all adieu. So I'll see you next week. And with a bit of luck, we're going to have Interstage, the non-biquad version, coming out next week. And you can hear what that sounds like. And I'll talk to you later.